I can tell you that a carbon tax will be a total economic disaster, not only for our province, but for our entire country. I'm here today to ring the warning bell that the risk of a carbon tax recession is very, very real.
Ontario Premier Doug Ford is ramping up his rhetoric around the federal climate plan. He says the federal government's carbon tax will cause a, quote, total economic disaster, predicting the price on carbon will lead to a recession. What proof does he and his government have that this will be the case? Rod Phillips is the Ontario Minister of the Environment, Conservation and Parks. He joins us from Queen's Park. Hi, Minister Phillips. Great to see you again. Thanks for your time.
Great to see you, Veshy.
Minister Phillips, the Premier this afternoon warned that the implementation of a federal carbon tax would cause a, quote, total economic disaster for Ontario and the entire economy. He also said that there are already economic warning signs on the horizon. What are those warning signs?
You know, Veshy, the Premier's speech today was about our priorities, which were ending hallway health care, making sure that we are making as many steps forward as we can on competitiveness for our businesses and about affordability for families. But a big part of his message was also about the anxiety that we feel from people in the economy, the concerns we feel from Ontario families about how expensive things are and just the economy in general. And so he stated, and I think it's a concern we've heard from a lot of people, a concern that the carbon tax that the federal government is insisting on putting in is going to add a risk to that economy, and that we don't need that additional risk, particularly when Ontario has a plan that is going to meet the federal government's targets of a 30% emission reduction. As you know, we already have reduced our emissions by 22%. We have a plan we brought out last year on that, and it seems unnecessary to us, and he wanted to make sure that not just Ontarians but Canadians were aware of the economic cost of bringing in that carbon tax.
But Minister, the Premier didn't just talk about the risk of what might happen. He said that the carbon tax would cause a total economic disaster for Ontario. And I'm just wondering, does your government have any proof of that? Or what specifics lead you to believe that, other than the concerns you're hearing you say?
You know, listen, the proof, I mean, the Conference Board of Canada brought out a report last year saying that a carbon tax would cost billions of dollars for the economy. That's billions of dollars out of the economy, out of people's pockets. But we hear it from our job creators all the time. There's a lot of pressure on them. There's a lot of competitive pressures on them. We want to grow jobs in this province, and we don't want to see anything that puts it in reverse. A cost on business, a cost on fuel, a cost on gasoline, this added cost, particularly when it's not needed to meet our climate objectives, is not going to be good for the economy. So he's raising that risk, and you know, people raise the risks related to climate change. I do as well. Those are important risks to raise, but we think there needs to be a balance in that. We also need to talk about the risks to the economy, and the carbon tax that the Liberal government wants to bring is a risk to the economy. It's going to make sure that it's harder to create jobs, and it's going to take money out of people's pockets. Our own financial accountability officer says $648. That's a lot of money out of someone's pocket.
Except for in the federal government's plan is actually reimbursing the citizens of Ontario or any province by which the carbon tax is applied. So the money, according to the federal government, will actually be returned to people. So when you're saying that that's part of the risk, is that not factually incorrect?
Well, no, our financial accountability officer says, and that's an independent officer of the legislature, $648 will be the cost in 2022. We know that the BC carbon tax started as revenue neutral. It's not today. It's one that the federal Liberals like to hold up as an example. And frankly, Veshy, I don't hear a lot of people very confidently talking about raising taxes and people getting more money back from that. That's not been people's experience. And I notice the federal government hasn't been talking about it a whole lot since they initially announced it. So, you know, we wait to see their plans on that, but I guess my bottom line is, if Ontario is going to meet its climate objectives, we're ahead of the rest of the country already, and we're going to meet our climate objectives, the ones that the federal government set. Why do we need to see this carbon tax imposed? Why do we need to see an added tax on businesses as well?
You brought up the example of BC, but in BC, where there is a carbon tax and where you're right, it has increased. For 5 years, average real GDP growth in BC has led the country by a significant margin. Their budget there is on track for a surplus. Their books are leading provinces when it comes to balancing their budget as well. Doesn't that go against the argument that you're trying to make, that our premier is trying to make, which is that this will most certainly lead to some kind of economic disaster or recession? That's not been the experience in BC.
Yeah, I mean, I don't think anyone would say that the reason the BC economy has been successful has been in front of a carbon tax. The opposition here were heralding the Alberta economy and how well it's doing because of the carbon tax as well today. I think that means they haven't been to Alberta in a while.
I don't think it's not because of the carbon tax. No one's saying that the economy there is growing because of it, but that it is in spite of it. Because you're making the argument that it will collapse because of it.
Yeah, listen, there is a certain amount of pressure and tax that people can take. But remember, Ontario families, the reason we've made the progress we are, the reason that we are further advanced than any other economy in terms of reducing carbon is because we have already made significant investments. So an Ontario family is already paying $400 a year for the elimination of coal, something that many other provinces haven't done. So we've taken the steps to be the leaders. We've put in a plan in place that is going to get us to the targets that the federal government set. And we don't see how another tax on top of the tax that is already being imposed and the taxes that are imposed is going to be helpful for this economy. I'm not hearing from businesses that what they need to be competitive in an increasingly global competitive economy. And a lot of people, Veshy, and you hear this, are very anxious about the global economy today. There's a lot of factors at play. But what they're not saying is add another tax and make it more difficult for us to compete. So that's his message. I think it's a message people need to hear. And it's one of the reasons why we're going to use all the tools that we have at our disposal to oppose the Liberals putting this tax on, that it's not necessary from an environmental point of view and it's bad for the economy.
I take your point, and I understand the concerns that you're reflecting, but I still am missing, where is the proof that this is a certainty that it will happen? You know, you have the example of BC, we have the example of other countries around the world. Point me to an example of somewhere where the economy has collapsed, that the recession has been caused because of a carbon tax. And I take your point about businesses and taxes and the seemingly added burden that so many businesses feel. But specific to the statement that the Premier is making, which is that there is the possibility of a recession solely caused by the imposition of a federal carbon tax, where is the proof?
So let me first just say, we talk about the carbon tax in British Columbia. Remember, their emissions actually went up this year. So just as a note on the success of the BC carbon tax, let's reference that. But what he is saying is that the cumulative effect of the taxes that are being felt by individuals and businesses are putting pressure on the economy. Layering on another tax, particularly an unnecessary tax that isn't going to be effective from an environmental perspective because we're already making those objectives, isn't necessary and is a risk. And it's a risk that people need to hear about. Now, it's not one tax, it's the combination of all of those pressures that will be put on not just businesses, but put on individual families. Especially, they're feeling that pressure, they're feeling significant pressure in terms of their ability to spend. We don't see this as necessary, and that's why we're going to keep raising the concerns and use all the tools we have, including the courts, to oppose it. It's not necessary environmentally, and it's going to hurt the economy. Nobody has disputed, too. Like, the federal government's own numbers have said it's going to reduce growth. The Conference Board of Canada says it's going to reduce growth. This isn't a new idea, but
the PBO says it's going to lower GDP by 0.5% by 2022. Yes. That's not a recession.
It depends on how much growth you have in the rest of the economy, whether 0.5%. But 0.5% adds up to jobs, adds up to people in people's pockets. These are real things for real people. So why wouldn't we want to not have a 0.5% reduction in our economy when we can already hit the environmental objectives we want to without it? That's the point we're making.
And the only question I have, though, on that is that we don't know for certain that those objectives will be met. I mean, your government has set out its own objectives, which were lower than the previous government's, which the federal government says, changes the whole picture federally as well.
Listen, they had expected Ontarians to do more than every other province. We aligned ourselves to their targets, their reduction that Justin Trudeau and that, frankly, Stephen Harper before him had agreed to. And as I said, we're sitting as the province who have made the biggest progress on climate change.
Under the last government, to be fair.
It's the people of Ontario who paid for this, Veshy. It wasn't any government, right? And if you want to give credit, it was actually started by the government before that was a Conservative government. But I'll prefer to give the credit to the individuals who've been paying it and continue to pay for it. And listen, Ontarians will continue to do their share. Climate change is an important issue, and we're going to do our part. But we have to understand that, your number, a 0.5% reduction, their number, in GDP, that is a reduction in growth. That is a reduction in jobs. That is a reduction in income. And we can't warn people enough that is something to be concerned about. We have to balance the economy and the environment. We think we can do that. We don't know why the federal government isn't interested in that.
All right, I'll leave it there. Thank you, Minister Phillips. Appreciate your time.
Thank you very much, Vashi.
I can tell you that a carbon tax will be a total economic disaster, not only for our province, but for our entire country. And there are already economic warning signs on the horizon.
Economic disaster. That's what Ontario Premier Doug Ford predicts will happen once the federal carbon tax is fully implemented. What is he basing that claim on, and why is he making the warning now? Time for the Power Panel. In Toronto, Brad Levine of Council Public Affairs, Yolande James, former Quebec Liberal Cabinet Minister, is in Montreal. And here with me in studio, Summa Strategy's Tim Powers and the CBC Zone, John Paul Tasker. Hi, everyone.
Hey, Vashi.
Nice to see you.
Hello.
Tim, I'll start
Thanks.
with you.
It's a disaster, Vashi. It's a disaster. Move on.
Okay, next. No, we did an interview with Environment Minister Rod Phillips asking him about, what kind of proof they have for that kind of claim, and we were discussing in the break that his language is a bit more nuanced. But why do you think, on the question of why now, why ratcheting up of the rhetoric? We've heard them criticize the carbon tax very often, but this is definitely a new line. Why now, do you think?
Well, it's the intensity and timing are interesting, right? How did the year begin? It began on January 1st with Andrew Scheer having a press conference talking about the impact of the carbon tax. I don't think it's any great secret that the Premier of Ontario, Mr. Ford, Jason Kenney and others, Scott Moe in Saskatchewan, they're all allied on this. So this is a big speech for Mr. Ford. I gather it was a very large audience at the Economic Club. So
I think the club said biggest audience they've ever had for a premier.
So not surprising, as we're inching closer to more election skirmishes, he's gone in this particular direction. I don't think he's overly fussed about the facts. I think he's more interested in the fuss. And the government of Ontario and other governments are hoping to make a fuss here. I think on the facts side, I give it to Rod Phillips. I think he managed the interpretation of it better than perhaps the Premier did. Because if you are going to say on an out-and-out basis that the carbon tax is responsible for a recession, that may be a bit of a stretch.
Yeah, I think he called it the carbon tax recession.
Yeah. But from political framing perspective, we've seen worse before. I mean, there are signs that the carbon tax is causing great consternation. Businesses are worried, as Rod Phillips said to you.
That point is an accurate one. I think you can say, lots of taxes additional taxes make businesses worried, but saying it's going to cause a recession is a different thing.
Well, I think you saw where the two tracks are going to go on this for the opponents of the Liberal government. You're going to have the stronger rhetoric of Doug Ford, and you're going to have the measured analysis of Rod Phillips, and you'll have both of that coming at people. Whether it works or not, I don't know, but that was a good preview today of what the next 9 months are going to be like.
Yippee. JP, what do you think?
Yeah, I mean, no question it was all a bit hyperbolic, which I know is shocking to our audience that Doug Ford would be a bit hyperbolic about all this. But I think he might be on to one point in particular, and that I think that there might be a downturn in some sectors of the economy, especially those sectors that really depend on hydroelectricity. I'm thinking about manufacturing in particular. And if you add any cost to the price of hydro in this province, it makes businesses less competitive, right? Like, there's nothing that would keep them here if those prices get so sky high. They could easily pick up and move to Ohio or Pennsylvania or somewhere else in the South where things are just a whole lot cheaper. So I think his contention that the entire economy is headed for a recession because of a relatively low federal price on carbon is obviously, as I say, hyperbolic. But there is the chance that this could have an impact on business, especially when those bills come in from Ontario Hydro every month. But also, to refute him just a bit, the only province that's really had a carbon tax in place for any length of time is British Columbia. And, they've really aggressively gone after the carbon emissions. They've aggressively priced it, and yet their economy has doubled in the last 10 years. So when you actually look at the facts from provinces in this country, it does show that there's not really a track record of running an economy into the ground just because we slap a price on carbon.
Yolande, let me pick up on what JP mentioned. Is there sort of something to tap into there? And that is, and Minister Phillips pointed to it as well, the sort of the government hearing from businesses that are maybe, let's say they're not specifically concerned about the carbon tax, but more about the sort of tax burden that they are sharing and the cost of doing business right now.
Well, I can understand that businesses, just like citizens, when you're coming in with a system or a new tax on carbon, that people would be concerned, but that's not what we were witnessing today. Doug Ford is playing his traditional, so far, playbook of just saying, well, it's going to be whatever the problem is today, it's going to be the carbon tax's fault. And I think, there's an expression in French, trop c'est comme pas assez. It gets to the point where if you're not able to back up your arguments with facts, it just becomes that you just discredit yourself completely. I just look to here in Quebec, just so that people know, we are in the cap and trade system, the same one that Doug Ford decided to pull out of, and that I guess he thought that what might be a loss for those of us that decide to stay in. Quebec was able to, in the first auction, make $250 million for the Green Fund here. And our economy so far, not going into recession, quite to the opposite. We're one of the best economies so far among the provinces in Canada. And he's willing to do that, pull out Ontario at a cost of billions of dollars. So at one point, are we talking about facts, and are we talking about what's in the best interest, whether it be environmentally, whether it be science-based, in the best interest of residents, or in what point are we talking about just rhetoric and wanting to score political points? And he actually, I believe, is putting Andrew Scheer in a tough spot, because yeah, you might be able to rally a certain amount of people, but there are a lot of people, conservatives as well, that are concerned about climate change and do expect the Conservative Party of Canada to have a credible plan as to how to attack pollution.
Brad, does the sounding of an alarm, though, is there the potential for it to work at all?
Well, from a political point of view, I submit that what today was about was messaging about the fear of bad news coming, which has nothing to do with the price on carbon that the federal government is imposing on Ontario, Saskatchewan, and New Brunswick. So if you live in any of those other provinces, what Trudeau is going to be, starting in April, will not impact you. Now, so Mr. Ford and all the financial analysis is suggesting that 2019 may be sluggish. We have the growth is looking much lower than 2018. Maybe 1.9 on average, but these are going to be readjusted. We may have more interest rate hikes, up to 2. Some analysts are saying in the next 12 months. So there's certainly the bell that's being rung is actually that things are going to be slowing down. What Doug Ford did today was just say, well, if there's going to be a recession, let me be the first out the gates to place blame in the minds of the jury, to put doubt in the minds of the jury as to the reason as to why we are having an economic slowdown. There is absolutely no facts, and there's a reason why Doug Ford doesn't take questions after these outrageous speeches, which are free of any facts. He provided no reasoning why Trudeau's carbon pricing on Ontario, Saskatchewan, and New Brunswick is going to lead to a nationwide recession. An absolute disaster. He claims no evidence, no proof, nothing. Now, to JP's point, absolutely. British Columbia not only has doubled their economy, the GDP in the last 10 years, but in 2019, they are going to lead the country in growth, and they've actually been finessing, ticking up some of their carbon pricing. And their economy seems to be doing just fine. So this is all about rhetoric. There's a reason why he doesn't answer questions from journalists after he makes it. And the only question I think he should be asked is, Mr. Ford, can you point to anything that would prove your point to be true? Because it is as truthful as me saying, you know what? The bell was rung when he got us Ontario, out of cap and trade. That's when the analysts started to say the economy was going to be soft. We could easily turn the tables on him and say the reason why we're going to have a recession in Ontario is because you got us out of cap and trade. There's no evidence to suggest that's the truth, nor is there for his assertion either.
Yeah, Brad's right. Sure, this is about political marketing, absolutely. And there are, if you're against the Liberal government, you do want to make it easy for the public to point the finger. You don't want to create for Justin Trudeau the excuse that it's no trade deal with China, it's a shrinking economy elsewhere, it's investor uncertainty. You want to make it easy for voters. Every politician does it. Let's not assume Doug Ford's the first at that. But on something Yolande said, and I think Rod Phillips again used that hit in his response with you, and I think it's a smart place to begin the debate if Conservatives want to have a discussion about the real costs of this. There are reports, the PBO, you mentioned that 0.5% impact on GDP. The Conference Board, very similar. I think the figure that both agree on is $3 billion. Well, that's not insignificant, and that's a legitimate argument to have about these changes. And then there's outcomes. BC, I think, in that program hasn't had the outcomes that it's wanted in terms of reducing carbon. You know, but no, we're not going to have that debate. We might have it here. That's
Oh,
not
we'll have it on this show.
We'll have it on this show, and people should watch this show, but I'd be very surprised that any leader nuances. Just look at the Prime Minister this weekend. You know, he went on a political marketing tact of his own. The Conservatives, they're mean, they're nasty, and they're like Stephen Harper, where it was, we talked about this on this show last week, it was his own candidate that was being mean and nasty. So guess what? It's the season of political marketing, and everybody's picking their targets.